The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents a debate review, How Cool Are Beavers? Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. This can be a different debate review. I did a debate recently with Ahmed Eshrah on whether or not a God exists, and he presented an argument that was basically all about beavers and beaver dams. Now, I'm not going to go through the entirety of the debate, and I'm not going to give you a complete primer on beavers, but there's a little bit of overlap here because it's an incredibly interesting subject and an incredibly understandable mistake on Ahmed's part. He spent a lot of time talking about what the beaver needs to understand and what counts as information and what counts as knowledge, and the fact that information must come from a mind. And if there's not a mind to teach these beavers this, if they're separate from their parents, then that means the mind that teaches beavers how to build a dam must be God, or for all practical purposes, the equivalent of God. Beavers can build dams without learning directly from their parents, which he found to be incredible. Oh, if you separate them from their parents, they still build dams. And that's not possible. You just can't have, a genetic code that predisposes someone to build a dam or a dam of a specific type. Well, yes, you actually can, and he's wrong about that. His view is that dam building requires an expert level of knowledge in engineering. You can't intuit engineering. It must be learned. But that's not correct. In fact, you can, and somebody did originally intuit the basic building blocks of engineering, trial and error through discovery. It doesn't have to be learned in the sense that an external mind has to teach it to you. Your mind can teach it to you through discovery. This is one of the key aspects that, along with evolution over great periods of time, that he ignored. His view that God is teaching beavers as if God is sitting around going, yes, here's how you build a dam. I know it's not necessarily like that. It can be that God basically implanted this information in a beaver, and yet if God's not actually sitting there telling the beaver, here's how you do this, then the information has to be implanted in the beaver. And since the information is contained in the beaver in its mind, and God doesn't have to sit there and keep tinkering with it, why on earth would you ever conclude that information couldn't be in a mind independent of a God? And it's because he has a very particular understanding or misunderstanding of information. His view is that if X creature does Y behavior, and Y behavior requires some underlying knowledge of Y, then that knowledge must have been attained by another mind. A bird can build a nest, though, without knowing the principles of engineering. One of the things that Ahmed kind of struggled with was this notion that since it takes human beings a long time to study and fully understand all of the aspects of engineering that we currently understand, when we look at a beaver dam, we see those aspects in there. And because we understand them and realize that this is what you must know in order to build a structure, that the only way to build a structure is to begin with that knowledge and understanding and then put it into place with a plan in effect. But that's not true. You could simply keep leaning things up by trial and error and just go with whatever happens to stay standing, which if you look at a beaver dam, the sticks are there haphazardly, and yet they're somewhat woven together. But you could build a much more efficient dam if you had a better understanding of engineering. And the fact that humans have this understanding doesn't mean that beavers needed to. It's a mistake to infer that the beavers know something. It's a mistake to infer that what is understood, to try to infer what is understood by the creature merely from observing their behavior. And Ahmed and others want to just dismiss the notion of instinct as if it's insufficient. Instinct is enough to make you do things like breathing, but not enough to make you do things like breeding. Well, if a child gets their G.I. Joe toys out and is out there playing and they build a mud fort or a trench, that doesn't mean they have a general's knowledge of war tactics. There are some things that we naturally intuit. It comes from being an intelligent species that can be taught, but also can learn and can discover. Knowledge doesn't have to be imparted by some other brain. It can be self-taught. You discover things independently through exploration and intellect. And even complicated acts can be accomplished without a knowledge of the underlying schools of study. The schools of study that we've created to teach people engineering is a way of keeping them from having to go out and do everything by trial and error, but the trial and error works. And for something that is both more complicated than just giving birth on a flat rock, the nesting behaviors of different animals appears to be something that requires some understanding that couldn't be done by intellect if you begin with this notion that it's all about the knowledge and information. Discovering something can be a skill. There are people who, whether you want to call it IQ or a particular penchant for a certain skill, are better at discovering things. Just like finding something is something that some creatures are better at. Some creatures have better eyesight, but they have better motion eyesight or better color eyesight, or they see in a slightly different spectrum. Or if I have the sort of brain that makes it easier for me to spot a worm, then I'll eat better than the birds that have to go hunting for a worm, that don't have as good of eyesight or that aren't born with those innate sort of abilities. I can breed without knowing biology. I can drive a car without knowing how cars work. I can build a rudimentary vehicle with just a board and some wheels without knowing the principles of engineering, the soapbox derby, what kids have done for ages of exploring and building things, and some of them can be quite complicated. In every case where we are teaching some piece of information, someone had to learn it first. Someone had to do the work of the engineering. That's what we are doing. We're passing along information we gathered, and whether we gathered it from another agent telling us or teaching us, or from our own exploration, doesn't matter. The teaching thing is independent from how the information was gained at the beginning. The notion that learned behavior can't become instinct has been addressed many times, and I'm not going to pretend that either myself or anybody else has a full understanding of this, but there's something that's called the Baldwin effect, which is how learned behaviors, and learned behaviors, for clarity for Ahmed, I don't just mean learned from someone else. It could be learned by the actual agent that's doing it. How do learned behaviors become instinct? Now, beavers over millions of years, maybe 7 million years at this point, have been building dams. And building dams is certainly advantageous. I don't think Ahmed or anybody else would say, well, there's no reason for them to even start building a dam. Of course there is. Nesting behavior is what we're talking about. What else is advantageous is producing offspring that are skilled at learning how to build a dam. And so if you're the first beaver to kind of learn to build a dam, you're not going to have offspring that start off knowing how to build a dam, but you're going to have offspring that potentially share a mindset with you, a brain capacity with you. Doesn't mean they're going to be exactly like you, but they're going to be similar. And so your ability to gain an understanding and do a task, your offspring are likely to share some of that. The offspring that are better at learning quickly how to build a dam for safety and for nesting, those are the ones that are likely to pass along that trait to their offspring. And over a long period of time, what you get is creatures that are capable of doing this with some learning and teaching, to creatures that are incredibly quick learners, so that they intuitively, instinctively do the same sorts of actions that their parents did with teaching and training. And then you get from a creature that is exceptional at learning to a creature that doesn't need to specifically learn aspects of this because it is more intuitive and more instinctive. And over millions of years, you get to a creature who is the offspring of generations upon generations of those who were quick studies and quick learners at intuiting how best to build and improve on a dam. And now you have creatures that don't even need their parents to teach them how to build a dam. It's the same thing with birds building nests. But the interesting thing here is that when we come to beavers, we only have 2 species. And so there's not a lot to compare it to. And this is probably why he used beaver dams instead of bird nests, because what we're talking about is essentially some of the same type of behavior. But birds build nests, and they build nests of different types. And the type of nest they build is divided along species line. Evolution supports the notion of birds of different species building different types of nests, because birds of different species will pass on their genes for intuiting and problem solving similarly to build similar types of nests, which is why you'll have some birds will build floating nests on water. Some will build them in the branches of trees. Some of them will build them in hollows of trees. Some of them will build them in crevices in rocks. Some of them will build them underground. All of these are bird nests. And some of them accomplish this by complex weaving of sticks together to create structural soundness. Some of them will do it with mud and other sticky substances to keep their nests together. But you don't have a swallow building the same type of nest as a golden eagle. And you don't have that building the same type of nest as a duck. And so the God model suggests that there's a God running around telling sparrows to build nest X and eagles to build nest Y. And you build a nest on water, you build a nest with this type of structure, you build a nest in branches, you do one in a hollow, whatever. God giving different instructions for the same basic task to different species of birds. If that's what's actually happening, it's almost dishonest, because it appears then that they are evolving along the lines of their species to build a particular type of nest. You don't get to see this because there's not as much diversity in beavers, where we have essentially two semi-aquatic beaver species left, and they are, they share a common ancestor going back 7 to 13 million years or so, I think. Don't quote me. I'm not an expert on beavers at all, but they share that history, and of course they're going to be producing similar nests because they're similar to their parents. Their problem-solving abilities are similar to their parents. Their ability to learn is similar to their parents. The way in which they're going to go about doing things is going to be similar to their parents. This is why we have this notion of speciation, that one species will branch off from a line, and this is where these similarities occur. And some of them are going to be specific similarities of morphology and phenotype presentation, and others are going to be expressed in a phenotype with behaviors that are derived from particular brains. And yet you can set all that aside, because even if we knew nothing about beavers, nothing about epigenetics, nothing about the Baldwin effect, instinct, intelligence, etc., God still isn't a warranted answer for how do beavers do it. His argument was, I don't see how this could happen without a God, therefore God. By definition, a God of the gaps fallacy is his argument. But we know a lot, and that makes us fortunate, because beavers are cool, and their dam building is cool, but Ahmed's failed imagination and failed investigation don't make their coolness proof of God. Instead, it seems likely that it's proof of their particular type of intellect and their ability to reach an understanding or intuit or follow directions, as the case may be, to lead to an instinct or intuit, is a part of evolution that would favor them. Their particular type of intellect and our ability to reach the wrong conclusions is a proof of a flaw in our intellect. We have this arrogant position to think that we are so much better than every other species, so much smarter, that we are the special ones. And our inability to understand something leads us to the conclusion that it must be God. That is a flaw. It's a flaw we know about. It's a flaw we can identify. It's not like atheists are sitting here saying, oh, no, that's a fallacy. And everybody else on the planet who believes in God's like, no, that's not a fallacy. No, you agree that it's a fallacy. You just don't recognize that that's what you're committing. We are so impressed with our ability to quickly understand things and understand them accurately, and our falsely perceived superiority over every other creature, that we just couldn't expect a semi-aquatic rodent could be capable of complex thoughts that lead to dam building unless there was some kind of God tinkering with it. We've invented insults like bird brain, which demonstrate our arrogance and our ignorance, as birds are far more intelligent than we thought, both problem solving and in the use of tools. Maybe it's time to invent the term beaver-brained as a label of praise rather than an insult for those who have demonstrated a capacity to not merely assume that anything they don't understand is somehow magic. We'll see you next time.